We weren't able to have Art Rohrheim at this Commander College, but he was able to be at a previous one, and we're going to show you a video of Art at a previous Commander College in an interview that our president, Jack Agar, had with our founder, Art Rohrheim. And you are going to be blessed as you watch this video of Art and Jack conversing together. So enjoy the video.
Well, I'd like Art to come on up, and Art and I are going to tell a story, and I'll start the story, and then Art can jump right in due time. It was probably about 5 years ago. Art came into my office and said, I want to go back into Chicago to Fullerton Avenue, where really Awana first started. I want to go back to that warehouse where we had church at the Northside Gospel Center, and the very floor that our kids ran around that first Awana circle. I want to see what's become of that place. And so he went. If I had any sense, I would have gone with him that day, because really the Lord put him on a path, an adventurous path, in which he was able to meet the owner, the present-day owner of this facility. And, Art, let me let you take it from there and tell us something about Tony and what basically transpired.
Well, this building was really an old furniture store that had been abandoned, had had a fire in it, and that became the first church back there. And we turned this old furniture, it was a two-story affair, and down below was the so-called sanctuary. We had nothing but kitchen chairs that we sat on when we first started up. But the second floor, of course, is where we had Awana, and it was there when I had some problems. I didn't have abilities when it came to ever thinking about. I was really the youth pastor, and I had no training in that at all. I didn't have any idea just exactly what I was going to do. But one thing I found out the Lord gave me a talent of, I could reach kids. And I was getting hundreds of kids. But that got to be a problem to me, because up there I'd have over 100 kids, and I was having the game period problems. Big problems with the game period. You know, how in the world, if you don't have discipline, you know what you've got. And I had chaos. I was saying, well, all right, now everybody be quiet. I want to give you the next game. Well, I know they all had a different idea what quiet was, you know. And that's when the Lord gave me, really, I know the Lord did, gave me the idea of putting together the Awana Square back there and the count of 5. And so that was very exciting, because I can remember, I wish I could have recorded this, because I told all the kids, I said, now you see that square over there? I said, I'm going to give 100 points to the team that lines up there first, perfectly quiet. And I said, all right, now I'm going to blow a whistle, and then you all head for your squares. And all of a sudden, they ran up to their circles, and they stood there perfectly still, and I was shocked. That was Awana's first miracle. That was it, the first miracle. Well, that's been thrilling. How little did I know that the Awana Square circle was going to be something God was going to use all around the world. I had no idea what the Awana circle was going to be. Well, then I thought, well, some years had passed now, and I thought, well, I want to go back and see even if that building is still there. And so as I went back there, there was a little, the building was there, but there was a little liquor store that they had put next to it, and they said the owner, he lived in the liquor store, and he was the owner. And I tracked him down, and he was behind a counter making out his orders for liquor and so forth, and I happened to have an Awana book with me, and I showed him a picture of his building, and he, boy, yeah, that's my building. I said, did you know that God really started something in that building? Yes, God did something wonderful in that building. Would you let me go up there and see just where that game floor was? Oh, when I got up there, I was so disappointed, because that had now been turned into a nightclub. And they had put a dance floor all across the floor, so there was no way that I could possibly see that game floor anymore. Well, let me give you a lesson. Don't give up. When you run into problems, just keep pursuing it. Well, I wanted to see that game floor. I wanted to know if it was still there. Well, I asked the owner if he'd allow me to drill a hole in his floor. That's kind of brazen, isn't it? And he said he would let me do it, and I drilled a hole in the floor, and there it was. That was like finding a gold mine. There was that game floor. Well, I had ideas then that, wow, wouldn't people like to have a piece of that game floor? But how in the world could I get that game floor up? How could I get it up? Well, I think a few days later, I went back there fear and trembling, and I remember I wrote out a check, a personal check for $500 to see if I could entice him to let me take up that game floor, and I'd put a brand new one in, so it would be, everything would be fine. Then I saw God do something. God did something. As I looked at him and I told him what I wanted to do, he looked at me and he said, you know, I really need this money. But he said, would you let me be part of it, of the program? Let me be part of it. I couldn't believe it. And we went in there a couple of weeks later with about 10 carpenters, and guess what? You know what was thrilling? Most of those 10 carpenters, they were some of the kids that had run around that game floor before, and they were now leaders. And so we took up the game floor, and so that was was wonderful. But then I thought, wait a minute. I said to him, wouldn't you like to see what God has done, what started here? I said, wouldn't you like to come over here to this building and I'll show you what God has done? And so he came over one Sunday. My wife and I were here, and we went to eat, and I took him back, and he looked around the building and he said, did God do all of this? I said, yep, he did. He said, God's done all of this. That's what God's done. And he was just absolutely overwhelmed. And then I took him up into my office, and I talked to him. I showed him a little video to kind of prepare him a little bit about what he's going to do about his life. And you know, while he was up there, he was ready to accept the Lord. Isn't that great? The greatest treasure was not getting the floor. It was winning him, wasn't it, huh? And then to think what God did. Here this fellow, he was a Cuban. And he had a real heart for Cuba. And he hadn't been there, but he knew the language real well. And about 2 months later, I was asked to go down to Venezuela to speak to, we had about 600-700 leaders down there. And I said, how would you like to come along and be my interpreter for me? And he went along with me. And he got up. And he was my interpreter. But the first testimony he gave in his whole life was there to 600-700 Awana leaders. Was that ever thrilling? Well, since that time, he's been down to Cuba. And today he's down in Chicago in a church down there, in a Spanish church. And he's very gifted musically. And he heads up the music down there in his church. So isn't that great to see how God does things? You couldn't plan it, could you? I went too long.
No, you sure didn't. Well, let me elaborate on his testimony. The way it happened, on the way down there, Art said, Tony, while we're down here, you're going to have to give your testimony. And Tony looked at Art, my what? Well, you're going to have to give your testimony. You're going to have to tell these people down there that you have faith in Christ now. And what happened? Well, he became a nervous wreck for about half a day. And he wrote it out, and he practiced it. He really prepared himself well. But when he got up in front of all these people, his heart was encouraged. I don't think he read a word from it. He just shared his heart and his testimony. And these people were up cheering for him. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And what I learned from that, and that is, when you bring people to faith, push them a little bit. Drag them along with you a little bit. Allow them to experience that stepping out in faith so that they might grow. And I really believe his spiritual growth was exponential because right off the bat, Art got him going, got him involved.
I really feel, a little bit like the preacher that got up to preach. He said, well, I've got so much to share with you this morning, I hardly know where to start. When a little pal on the front run said, why don't you start somewhere near the end?
Well, I've got a story. Back at the Northside Gospel Center, they eventually moved out of that Fullerton Avenue warehouse. They built a beautiful building. And, of course, Awana continued to just grow and grow and grow. And then, of course, other churches began to show up because the fame of Awana spread far and wide. Churches were showing up from around Chicago, and then some churches from Indiana and over in Michigan and Kansas, Iowa. And Art and Lance would just reach out, invite them in, come watch, come learn, take it back, see if you can get some excitement going in your church with children and youth. And in time, they began to publish and develop some things. And before long, that Northside Gospel Center, where there were boxes everywhere. And one day, Lance had to have a heart-to-heart with Art, and Lance had to come to a decision. This ministry called Awana was getting too big. They were outgrowing the facility that they were using, the Northside Gospel Center. So, Art, take it from there and tell us about that first building that we moved into.
Well, that first building, I didn't even think we were ever dare to get into anything that classy. It was just a 2-story building, and well, like he said, we had grown out of it. And one day I just went for a ride. The Lord said, "Well, okay, get going, looking around." And I saw this building, but I thought, "Oh, this is far more than what we need." But there again, the Lord took over, and we got people to take, and the building was going to cost us some $40,000. And we got it through interest-free loans. These people just took and let us use their money, interest-free. Isn't that great, the way the Lord took and provided that for us? And how little did I know, I looked at that building, and I had a guilt complex. We don't need all this room. People are going to say we're really overdoing it here. And it wasn't long before that place was completely packed out, and then we had to go from building to building to building. But let me go back a little farther and share with you. We still didn't have this building, but Awana was really beginning to grow. And then I was getting phone calls. We had no missionaries, not one missionary at that time. And I was getting phone calls saying, "Come and help us, come and help us, come and help us." And that really, really got to you because I had nothing to give to them. And I thought, well, what do we do? And you know, in the Lord's work, the Lord just leads you on, take the next step. Well, I thought maybe we could make a film. But I thought, well, I used to take pictures, but I wasn't that quality for me to make a film. But here's what God did. There was a fella in a church that had Awana, gave me a call because we had never announced it. I had never told hardly anybody that I wanted to film. But God somehow got the message of this fellow. He says, "I understand you'd like to make a film." He says, "I've worked with Moody, with their film department there, and he says I'll be glad to work with you on making a film for you." And he says, "I've got some vacation time. I'll help you with that." And he came in. Well, that was just the beginning of bewilderment. How do you make a film? How do you do this? He says, "Well, you're going to have to get a script." Well, where do you get a script? I couldn't write a script. I didn't have any of those abilities. And, you know, the Lord just prods you. All right, come on, now think. Take the next step. Then I thought, I remember hearing the Unshackled program. Ever hear of the Unshackled program over Pacific Garden Mission? And the producer of that was Jack Odell, a very wonderful Christian fella. And I called him. I said, "Jack, I need help. Would you help me write a script?" He says, "I'd be glad to." And he came in. I sat down and talked with him for a couple of hours. Within a couple of weeks, he had a script for the film. But now, what do we do now? Now we have to build sets. Build sets? Like they do? Yes, down in the basement where I had this Awana circle, we start putting up walls and so forth. And all of a sudden, we had a film. And was that ever thrilling? Now we could at least send that out. It really didn't instruct anybody, but it showed them a little bit about what Awana was all about. But how did God use that film? One day, I get a call. I'm up at camp. I'm still directing Camp Awana. And I was just about ready to go into an activity. And, you know, and when those things are happening, you don't want anyone to bother you. But a phone call came through, and Art said somebody from New York that insists that he talk with you. Now, this fellow got me on the phone, and I did something that really I should never have done, except that God was in this thing here. Here's a fellow, I had no idea who he was. He says, "I saw your film. That's exactly what we need out here." He says, we've got churches out here that need that desperately. Would you come on out here? And I should have said, well, why don't you send me a letter? Then I could think about it and pray about it. But I agreed to go. And I remember going out there on the plane, out there to New York, and get off the plane. And he came to meet me and took me out. He lived in a house way out in the country, an old farmhouse, and went to his house. He had 5 kids, little kids, and while I sat there, they crawled all over me and so forth. I didn't mind that too much. But he said, I'm a full-time employee with IBM. And he said, I'll have to go to work tomorrow morning. But he says, I've got my car out here. And he says, it's filled with gas. And he says, here are the keys, and here's a list of churches that you can go visit. All of a sudden, he made me the missionary. I became a missionary. I hadn't chosen to be one. And I started going and visiting some of these churches because then he got involved. Now, here's a fella that's really just an ordinary fella. Not a fella that really wanted to get up in front of people, hardly at all. He was the type of behind-the-scene man. And we drove all the way out there with our staff to help them run a leaders conference. And one time I remember the first time we went out there, they had only 40 people out there. And we had driven 14 hours each way with a car full of our staff. And we said, is it worth it? But guess what? This fellow, we have a room upstairs called the Spencer Room. That was Leo Spencer. And did God use Leo Spencer? That fellow, I don't know if we could ever estimate. There might be 1,000 churches in the East Coast that somewhere along he's had a part in it. He actually persuaded 10 missionary couples to be part of Awana. Isn't that interesting how God works? You see, you couldn't plan something like this. It's just what God does. And so, really, to be able to talk to all of you, it's a real honor for me. Believe me, I just don't say that. But I realize the tremendous potential that is right in this room that could affect thousands and thousands of lives. I've said the big advantage I've got of being the age I am is to see the fruit of the Word of God, isn't it? And I remember some years ago, I had a fellow come into my office. And he said, Mr. Rohrheim, he says, I believe I appreciate Awana more than you do. I'd never anybody say any of that to me before. I says, oh, you do? He says, oh, yes, I do. I said, why do you say that? He says, well, I was raised over in Germany. My folks were part of the Holocaust. And he says, I was there. And he says, our lives were at stake. He said, we didn't know from one day to the next whether they're going to come in and we were going to be slain or shipped out somewhere. And he said, God spared us. And he says to think, now, I'm a commander. I'm a commander. And he says, the doors are wide open. There's nothing keeping me back from reaching out and winning these kids to Christ and getting all these parents and so forth. Oh, am I excited. Now, that's the excitement we all need, don't we, huh? And I needed that. I thank the Lord for the people who have come across my path and really have stirred me up because, like the Apostle Paul, he says to stir up the gift of God that is in us, shouldn't we, huh? Stir it up what's in us. And then I've often shared in that original club, one of the teenagers that came up to me. I remember he came out of a dysfunctional home, really a messed up home, but he was a kid that got saved and really grew in the things of God, really matured. I think he was probably about 15, and I remember he came up to me and he says, Art, I don't want to grow up and be an ordinary Christian. Ordinary Christian. I said, well, Jack, what do you mean by being an ordinary Christian? He said, well, I go to church, he says, and it's a lovely place, and all these kind people. But he says, as I look around, I don't see a heart passion there to really, really give their lives to serve the Lord. And he says, I don't want to grow up and just be an ordinary Christian. And you know, that was his heart. That was his heart. What do you think God did with that fellow? He wound up over in the Philippines as a missionary with he and his wife. And today, we have also the benefit of that because his grandson or his son-in-law is on our staff here at Awana, one of our key video people that's right here, see? And so you see the fruit of it all, don't you? These people, when you look out at all these kids, what do you see? It's really a gold mine, isn't it, huh? It's a gold mine. There's gold out there to be mined, and to mine gold, it takes work, it takes hard work, and a lot of discouragement. But, oh, the rewards are great, aren't they, huh? So just, I trust that all of you are going to go back and not be ordinary commanders. I trust not. I hope you're going to go back and light some fires, huh? I mean, light some fires, not just warm them up, but just go and really get some fires underneath them and really cause them to really get on fire for the Lord.
How about a quick trip through the Fairmont Fair, which was a brilliant idea back then?
All right. When I was back at this furniture store, one thing that got to me up 2 blocks up the way was a theater, the Liberty Theater. And on Saturdays, I would see the kids line up for two blocks to get into the theater. And the Lord just kind of talked to me and said, boy, wouldn't it be great if you could have them line up for two blocks to really get in to hear the gospel come into our club. And so I came up with an idea. I had what I called a sword club, some kids that came in right after school that were my key kids that had special Bible work and so forth. I said, here's the plan. They represented a couple of schools, and I went to the school principals. You couldn't do this today, but back there I could do it. And I got permission from the principal that these kids could go out when the patrol boys went out, just ahead before the kids went out. And I put striker cards, like regular striker cards on these kids. And on it would say, would be, coming, big fair. And the instructions were this: they would just march around the block, around the school, and they couldn't answer any questions. Big fair, that's all, big fair. The curiosity was killing these kids. The next week, this was only for the pals at that time. The next week, they said, well, big fair, just for boys, 8, 9, and 10. Well, then the girls all cooled off on that one. And then the night before the fair, coming the big fair, and we passed out these leaflets. This is your ticket to the fair. And then I also had a couple of kids whose dads back there were in the produce business, and they had horse and wagons, actually horses. They'd go up and down the streets, and sell produce. Well, we got all these horse and wagons too, and so we on that day we went out and picked up kids with the horse and wagons, but I had 325 pals show up for the Fairmont Fair, and it was great. We had a whole line of I don't know how many gals that helped us to sign them all in, and so forth, and out of that fair, a number of those kids had accepted Christ. I know are in the work of the Lord today. I was telling them a little bit about the table, about our first uniforms. This whole building, furniture store, it had an elevator in it that took the furniture up to the second floor, that elevator shaft had never been used for years, and I was looking down into that shaft, and it was just filled with everything. But I saw an old trunk laying down there, and the curiosity got me to go down and look at that trunk. Now, you know, the Lord does a lot of things that there's no explanation for. This being in a furniture store, I got down there and I opened up that trunk. That trunk was filled with hundreds of red, blue, green, yellow beanies. And out of that, I thought, wow, we can't throw these away. And so I put together a little monogram. I turned them all over to my dear wife, and she sewed those monograms on all those beanies, and that became our hat. I got a T-shirt made, and that was our first uniform. That was it. And the kids were just as proud then as they are today, because that was it. To be able to get a beanie, they had to work for that to be able to get their beanies. So that's that's it. But then, of course, later on, I wanted to get Awana started, I didn't know where to get uniforms. In fact, I didn't know where to get anything. And the Lord had to teach me everything, where to get it. And so I said, well, where do you get a uniform? So I went up to the first policeman I saw. I said, where do you get your uniform? And he told me. And do you know the first Awana uniform? They were all police uniforms. That's right. They were for the leaders. That was the first uniforms we had. We started out with just mimeograph tests. You see, we had an entrance test, and then we put together a little sword drill, and then we had crafts and so forth. So it was just all mimeograph. But the big problem was when we started to get a book together, then we really ran into trouble because this was all for the boys. And can you imagine what the girls were doing? Say, what about us? Don't you see? And so we had to now get that all set up for the girls. But let me share you. There's a picture out there of a special kid. Here's a couple of kids that came back to that old furniture store. I remember when they came. They came from the hills of Kentucky. I mean, from the hills. Their aunt brought them up there, and they stood there and they looked at the games going on. They were almost scared stiff what they were seeing. But it wasn't long before both of them got saved and really got all excited about the things of the Lord. And this one fella, I don't think he was really, if it was a kid that didn't have any talent, he just didn't look like, he wasn't sports-minded, he wasn't very attractive, and you just wouldn't pick him out. He looked like a real loser. But I remember one time I was leading pals, and I was leading the singing. I can remember, I wish I had a picture of this. In comes this fella, I think he was probably about 14 or 15, and he walked in there, and he had a dozen pals behind him. A dozen pals behind him. And he took and sat them all down. Guess what? This fella, he lived at least 5 miles away. They had to take the streetcar at those days. He went to their homes and got permission to bring these kids there. He paid out of his money the streetcar fare to bring those kids there. And I remember going up to him and said, wow, I'd like you to be one of my leaders. He said, who, me? He just didn't feel qualified at all. But, when back there in those early days when we didn't have any money and we had to run these paper drives, we ran these paper drives to get the money to buy that first press. This fellow, Jim Barker, was a fellow who ran those paper drives for me. Now, this fellow was real good at knot tying and anything with crafts. And the first craft tests that we had in Awana were all written up by this fella, Jimmy Barker. But he was a novel fellow. He came to club, and because he was so good at knots, he always had a rope in his pocket. And when these kids would come in early, he'd say, listen, how would you like to work on your crafts? And I'll show you how you can tie your knots. Oh, you will? And you'd see him over in the corner. And there he is, working with knots. And I tell you, it wasn't very long before he was leading those kids to Christ. He led more kids to Christ than any leader I've ever had. And then one day he says, Art, I believe God's called me to be a missionary. And he was so vital to us. And off he went to Venezuela, down into the jungles. And while he was down there, he translated a good portion of the Bible and put together materials back there. So, and then his brother that was with him, he became a pastor, and pastor for many, many years. And so here are two kids, both of them looked like real losers. But no, they weren't. Boy, they were real gems for the Lord. So now these are the people, you see, God set across my path to encourage me. And you don't know how much they meant to me when I saw these kids. And of course, if you don't know the story of when we go out and picked up papers, when I got these kids together, because we had no money, because we were building a church, and I had about 30, 40 of them, and I said, it's one thing to say with your mouth you love the Lord, but I want to see how much you really love him. And so I want you here at 8 o'clock now every Saturday morning, and we're going to take the bus and go out and pick up paper, and we could sell that paper, and we're going to buy a press. And it wasn't long before we had the money to buy that first press. But then the next problem was we didn't have anybody to know how to run a press. And so I had to learn how to run a press. But here's the thing I would like to get across to you. This is the only way God works. It's not my ingenuity or cleverness. But I would print with my associate. In fact, this fellow Rich Wager that I was telling the people at our table, who was my first employee, he was a very, very vital man with me. We early in the morning, we'd get down and we'd start printing pages for our first book. And then we'd lay them out on tables. Now, all right, now what do you do from there on in? These books all have to be collated. Now, here's something that God did. These kids had such a heart for it. God laid it on their hearts. These were normal kids who in those days, kids like to play outside and do all kinds of things. But they came right from school, many of them. And there they are. They went around the tables and they collated all these books for us. And I looked back today, if God hadn't provided those kids, I don't know if I'd ever gotten any books done. There was no money to do anything like that. But God did that, and that was a real encouragement. And I run into some of these kids today that were part of that group that collated these books for us. So yeah, what I'm trying to tell you is God put Awana together, you see. It's and that's why all of you out there, you want God to do some great things for you, don't you, huh? It's not going to be all the great information you're going to get here. I thank God for the abilities that Larry Fowler has and the team has here, that they're able to share with you. But we know that all of that, you know, God's got to take in. He's not going to depend on your knowledge, is he? He wants you to really step out by faith and trust him to do those great and mighty things which you don't know how you're going to do it. And just believe God's going to do it, and you're not going to wind up being just an ordinary commander. Now, just in closing, let me ask you one question. Now, this is my opinion. If I were to ask you, what one ingredient do you think determines more than anything else, if you were to name just one thing, to be a fruitful Christian, what do you think that would be if it was just one thing? I feel very strongly there's only one answer to that determines the fruitfulness of you as a Christian is how much do you love God? Now think about that. How much do you really love him? We know one of the commandments, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Yes, that's a commandment. But if we really, you know, it's so easy to say, I love God. It's so easy to come out of our mouth that we love God. But you see, if we really, really are in love with him, okay, our witnessing for him, our scripture reading, and all of that will fall right in place, won't it? Because when you really love him, he'll just flood your heart with what he wants you to do. So just take inventory. I have to inventory myself. How much do I really love him? Because that determines, doesn't it?
Amen.